Right. So I used to hate church, especially after I got back from Japan. I went to college for 4 years in North Carolina. Then lived in Japan for a couple of years, and then I came back to Southern California. Came back to the church where I grew up, a church that the best way to think about it at the time was to think of maybe like a small town Midwestern church kind of plopped down in the middle of Orange County. You know, hour and a half long sermons, very doctrinal, a lot of systematic theology, people who were dressed up, dressed real nice, and I don't know, I couldn't stand it. It was boring. There was no, for me, what I discovered out in the world, passionate worship, things like that, things that had come to love. The church just seemed, I don't know, it just didn't seem like there was any life there. It didn't feel like it was thriving. And there's a lot of reasons for that, a lot of possibilities, but it just felt like it was just tradition. I couldn't quite figure out why we were doing what we were doing. It was like we were there and we were there week to week and we loved each other, but there was no sense of this is what we're about, this is what we're doing, this is where we're going. Um, and it wasn't that we didn't have the important things, spreading the gospel and sharing the love of Jesus, inviting people to follow him. It wasn't that we didn't do those things. It just didn't feel right. Well, about that time, maybe 6 months to a year after I started feeling that way, I came across an essay written by ethicist Stanley Hauerwas. Um, he's taught at different places, Notre Dame, Duke. He's Methodist, or at least was. And he had read this book that came out, I believe, in the 1970s. I think it's like 1972 when it first came out. It's by this British author. It's called Watership Down. And it's a story about a bunch of rabbits. Which is random, but it's true. It's a story about a war in a community of rabbits, and something happens, and these rabbits have to band together, and they go on this big adventure. We'll talk a little bit about that in a second. But Hauerwas saw this, and as he read it, he thought, this is what church is. This is what church is about. Now, like I said, Hauerwas is an ethicist, so he's really concerned about people doing what they're supposed to do, right? Living right, living wrong, what's right, what's wrong, and how do we tell the difference? That's kind of his bread and butter. And yet, as he starts thinking about that in the context of this book, Watership Down, he starts talking about what church is. He starts doing ecclesiology by accident, you might say. He's discovering anew what the church is, what she is about, and doing it by reflecting on this book. So the book, there's two main characters we'll talk about. Hazel, he's the leader, and Fiver, his brother, is kind of like a visionary or a seer. And there are these two rabbits, and Fiver, the visionary or seer, has a premonition and realizes that the warren, the community of rabbits, is in danger, that something terrible is going to happen. And so he convinces his brother Hazel, we've got to get out of here. And the community of the Warren, they don't buy into it. They're not excited about it. And yet, Hazel believes deeply in his brother's vision. And so he gathers a faithful crew, a small community of rabbits, and they say, that's it, we're out of here. We're going to go find something new. We're going to find a new home. We're going to go on a journey. We're going to do this thing together, this adventure. We're going to have a big adventure. Now, as with any adventure, if you've read any stories of adventure, you've seen any movies about adventure, you know that what makes adventure is that problems crop up. There are things get in the way. There's challenges. People start out excited and we're going somewhere, we're doing something, and then we start to lose hope, lose faith when challenges present themselves, and we start to lose heart. We wonder if we're doing the right thing. And through it all, Fiver, who's not only a visionary and a seer, he also begins to tell stories. So the rabbits be going through that have a tough day, that's raining, there's predators, whatever, and they sit down around the campfire, whatever it is that rabbits do. And Fiver begins to tell stories about Frith, who's the creator god of the rabbits. He tells stories about El Araira, who's this famous amazing rabbit. He's a trickster rabbit. He's devious, and he finds ways to thwart all the rabbit enemies by being clever and coming up with traps and deception. And he's so clever and he's so amazing that under his leadership, rabbits thrive like they've never thrived before. And so as he tells these stories, the little community of rabbits, they think about them. And they see themselves in these stories. They recognize their own situation in these stories about El Arira, the clever trickster rabbit, and about Frith, the creator of the rabbits. And they see themselves as part of these stories, and they see their own adventure, their own movement to a new community of rabbits, to a new warren. They see their own adventure as being a continuation or as being a retelling of these stories. And so these stories offer a chance for reflection, a chance to think about who we are and what we're doing, and are we being faithful to the legacy that El Arira left us? And if not, how are we not? And if we are, how are we? And if we're not, or maybe we shouldn't be. In some ways, we need to change or to rethink how El Arira did things in order to make them relevant and real for our community now as we're on this adventure. Well, if you're not hearing it already, you can see how Hauerwas thinks about this. He says this little community of bunnies is a story-formed community. They have this vision or this goal that Fiverr gives them and that Hazel encourages them to follow. It's this adventure to go and become this community and go to this place and find a new home. That's kind of their goal, their vision. But what sustains them through all the challenges and difficulties of travel and journey and adventure are the stories that they have about their community, the one who founded it, and the God who made it possible. And of course, for Hauerwas and for us, for Christians, that's the scriptures and principally the stories of Jesus. And I think if Hauerwas we're gonna break that down for the church, I think it really gives us kind of three things that the Bible does as it creates the church in a way. I mean, really the Spirit creates the church, but the Spirit does that through the Scriptures. The Scriptures nourish the church, and the Scriptures transmit the message that makes the church possible. And so I think that he would say there's probably three things. The first is the Scriptures or the stories identify the community, and we've talked about that. We talk about this in other lectures. That we identify as the people to whom Jesus speaks, right? That names us, it identifies us, and it says that's the community. The community is just those people who say, yep, Jesus is talking to me. He said follow to me, and I'm following. That's it. But then also there's two other things. The scriptures, the way the Spirit speaks through the scriptures also gives the vision or the goal for the community. And that could be as simple as just saying something like the Great Commission. But it might be something more complex. The point is that where we get our idea of where we're going and what we're doing comes from the scriptures, the stories that we tell. And that might be a complex process, and I don't want to just reduce that to, go therefore and make disciples. That's not hugely important. It is, but it might be more complex, and that's okay. The point is that the Bible or the scriptures not only identify the community, but also give the community the vision of where we're headed. And I think what's interesting about Watership Down is that Fiverr he's a seer, he's a visionary. And I mean, it's hard not to hear some of the charismatic Pentecostal expressions of Christian faith in that, the idea that God does speak. It's hard to know exactly how God speaks, and somehow Scripture is involved in that process. As evangelicals, we can't deny that. But there might be ways in which God gives fresh vision, fresh ideas, fresh goals for a community that's somehow mediated by the Scriptures, but isn't necessarily, just laid out in a 1, 2, 3 format. And that's interesting. It's interesting that the Scriptures really are tons and tons of narratives, tons and tons of stories. And stories, they teach us, they form us in a different way than a set of rules. And so our vision and our goals are probably set in more than just a set of rules. They're probably shaped by the way that stories in the Scripture are told, the way that the stories in Scripture are received by us, and how they're transmitted. So it's a complicated process, but we want to say that the Scriptures and somehow the Spirit mediated through the Scriptures gives the vision of where the church is headed. So the Scriptures identify us. The stories of the gospel identify who we are. They also then function in an interesting process that gives us a vision for where we're headed. And then lastly, I think they offer the resources for us to reflect on how we're doing, where we're going, how we're getting there, and if we're doing it right. And I want to make really clear that this is not the same thing as imitation. Resources for reflection do not mean um, just resources for imitation. And just a simple example of how that works, um, we've often heard that David is a man after God's own heart, King David in the Old Testament. And yet, David is not the kind of person that we want to imitate. Or if we do want to imitate, we have some major caveats, some major drawbacks, because David does some pretty awful things. In fact, the second half of his life it's not great. If it's anything, it's a warning for how not to finish. He does a lot of things that set up Israel for disaster in the future, and you can read about those things. My point being that the story isn't there to say, here's the point by point. This is how you do, Christian life. You follow the steps that David followed. And even to some extent, it's not Jesus. I mean, we don't probably go around washing feet. We probably don't go around doing a lot of the different things that Jesus did. Jesus serves as a template. He has important teaching, but his story is not one of strict imitation. We don't do exactly what Jesus did. We contextualize it. We reflect on it. But that's what I'm saying. It's not imitation. It's reflection. The stories give us a sense of what's happened before that kind of identifies us and gives us a sense of where we're headed, and also offers resources and materials, but those resources and materials are for reflecting. You think in Watership Down, the bunnies are sitting around the fire and they tell the stories, and then they relate their own experiences, and then out of that meshing, the community adapts and changes and becomes different in the things that they think and believe and do in order to, well, as Hauerwas says, be formed by the stories and not to slavishly imitate them. So that's kind of my take on Hauerwas's story form community reflections on Watership Down. You guys should read it. Read his article, and fortunately I hadn't read the book before I read the article, but the article inspired me to read the book, and it was fascinating. It's wonderful to read that book, thinking church behind everything. So if you're looking for some extra reading material, I would highly recommend doing that. Final thing. So my own church community. It was fascinating the way that just reading Hauerwas's article and then reading Watership Down changed the way I started to think about my church. It changed my vision for who we were and what we were doing. Nothing cosmetic changed. It's not as though suddenly overnight our church services changed or our relationships changed. None of those things changed. But by conceiving of who we were and what we were doing differently, I began to see kind of behind the scenes. Oh, this is why we do this thing. This is why it matters. And yeah, there might be some place for revision in that. We might want to rethink some of the stuff we're doing there. But suddenly, I stopped seeing church as this place that I was going. It wasn't a building that I was going to, and then we sang some songs and we listened to some people talking about the Bible. That wasn't what church was anymore. Instead, church was a community of people going on a journey together and trying to figure out that journey as we went, trying to deal with the challenges of that journey and doing it together. And the way that we did it was we kept talking about these stories that founded us, that we kept talking about Jesus, our El Arira. We kept talking about Yahweh God, our Frith. And as we talked about those things and we broke bread together and we hung out and we did life and we raised kids and we got married and we buried each other and we did these as we did all of those things together, I began to see that church isn't the place I go on Sunday. Church is the life I live with the people that I love.